June 2nd, 1953, Westminster Abbey, one of the most watched moments in history. Millions of people around the world tune in to watch Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. The pageantry is magnificent, the robes exquisite. Hundreds of dignitaries fill the historic abbey. And then a photographer captures something nobody was supposed to see. Princess Margaret reaches up to adjust a decoration on Group Captain Peter Townsend's uniform, a divorced man. It's not just the gesture, it's the look in her eyes. Pure tenderness, pure love. That single photograph, published worldwide, triggers a constitutional crisis. It divides a nation. It forces a young woman to choose between the man she loves and everything she's ever known. This is the story of Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend, a love that became a national obsession, a scandal that rivaled politics, a tragedy played out on the world stage. It's a story that will change how you think about duty, love, and the price we pay for a tradition. Part 1. The Princess and the Pilot. Princess Margaret Rose, born August 21st, 1930, in London. She was the younger sister of the future Queen Elizabeth II, born just 4 years earlier, while Elizabeth bore the crushing responsibility of being heir to the throne groomed from infancy to eventually. Let the British Empire, Margaret enjoyed something Elizabeth had never had in her entire life: freedom. As the second child, she would never be queen. This absence of absolute obligation gave Margaret room to breathe, to develop her own personality, to explore who she truly was, rather than being bound by the rigid expectations placed upon an heir. She had space to become a person, not merely a symbol. And Margaret was nothing if not a person. She was vivacious, witty, charming, and artistically gifted beyond measure. She had genuine talent for piano and a gift for performance and dramatics that went far beyond what royal princesses were typically expected to display. Those who knew her well described her as the more glamorous, fun-loving, genuinely human of the two sisters. Where Elizabeth was duty-bound and reserved, constrained by the weight of her inheritance, Margaret was playful, passionate, and spontaneous. She wore her heart on her sleeve. She laughed freely. She danced with abandon. She was alive in a way that the heir to the throne could never afford to be. After World War II ended in 1945, Margaret came of age in a Britain that was gradually transforming. Post-war austerity and rationing slowly gave way to cautious optimism about the future. In the early 1950s, Margaret became a celebrated cultural figure, quite literally the face of modern Britain. She was fashionable, she was fun, and she seemed to embody the freedom and youthful vitality that the post-war generation desperately wanted to believe was possible. She represented the new Britain that was emerging from the ashes of conflict. This was a princess who wanted to truly live her life, not merely exist within the confines of royal duty. Now enter Peter Townsend. Born November 22nd, 1914, he was a highly decorated Royal Air Force officer with an illustrious and genuinely remarkable military career. During World War II, when Britain faced its darkest hour and fought alone against Nazi Germany, Townsend became one of the nation's most celebrated fighter pilots. He flew Spitfires with exceptional tactical skill and extraordinary physical bravery, shooting down 11 enemy aircraft during the conflict. He was more than a decorated officer. He was a genuine war hero, someone who had proven his courage and character under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. After the war concluded, Townsend's distinguished military record caught the attention of the royal household. In 1944, while still actively involved in the war effort, he was appointed as an equerry to King George VI, Margaret's father. An equerry was far more than a mere servant. He was a gentleman of refinement and education, a personal aide and trusted companion to the monarch. He would be present at both private moments and public ceremonies, carrying with him not just physical presence but responsibility and privilege. It was a position of considerable trust and genuine intimacy within the royal circle. Townsend was, by all accounts, a genuinely remarkable man. He was handsome in that distinctly English way, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and kind, intelligent eyes, possessing an easy and natural charm that immediately put people at ease. He was intellectually accomplished, well-read, refined in his manner and deportment. By all accounts, he was the kind of man that other men instinctively respected, and that women found extraordinarily attractive. He carried himself with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a decorated war hero, someone who had proven himself under the most extreme circumstances and had not found himself wanting. But Townsend carried with him one very significant burden that would come to define his romantic fate. He was a divorced man. He had been married in 1941 to Rosemary Rollins, the daughter of a Burmese general, but the marriage had unfortunately foundered and failed. They divorced in 1952. In the 1950s, divorce was not merely scandalous, it was considered socially and morally catastrophic, particularly in the upper echelons of British society. Divorce carried with it a powerful moral taint, a suggestion that one had failed in one's most fundamental personal obligations. And in the Church of England, divorce was even worse than being merely socially unacceptable. The Church did not recognize divorce at all. Marriage was, in Church doctrine, absolutely indissoluble. A divorced person had, in the eyes of the Church, broken a sacred vow made before God. This was not just a private shame. It was a spiritual failing of significant magnitude. Yet despite this significant impediment, Townsend was retained in his position after the war. He was simply too valuable to the royal household, too admired, too much an integral part of its functioning. He became a constant, familiar presence at Buckingham Palace in London, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland during summer, at Sandringham House in Norfolk during winter. He was always there, a trusted figure, respected and relied upon. The crucial detail, the one detail that would come to define everything, Townsend was 16 years older than Margaret. When Margaret was born in 1930, Townsend was already 16 years old. When he joined the royal household in 1944, Margaret was just 14, still essentially a child. When the war ended in 1945, she was only 15, still a girl finding her way in the world. He was a man in his early 30s, a decorated war hero, a fixture in her father's court. But Margaret grew rapidly. The years between 1945 and 1950 witnessed a remarkable transformation. The girl became a woman. The shy, reserved princess became the glamorous, sophisticated young woman who captivated the nation. And Townsend, who had always been present, who had always been a trusted member of the household, was suddenly seen through entirely new eyes. By the late 1940s, the attraction between them was becoming increasingly obvious to those around them. Those who knew them both reported noticing subtle but unmistakable signs. The way they looked at each other across crowded rooms, the way they found excuses to be in conversation, the way Margaret's eyes would light up with visible joy when Townsend entered a room. For Margaret, who had been surrounded her entire life by people who deferred to her because of her title and her position, Townsend represented something absolutely revolutionary. He treated her as a woman, not merely as a princess. He engaged her in real conversation about real things, art, literature, philosophy, history. He didn't stand in awe of her. He was genuinely and deeply interested in her thoughts and opinions. He listened to what she said. He cared about her perspective. For someone who had grown up in the gilded cage of royalty, always the focus of attention but rarely truly seen or known as a person, this genuine connection was intoxicating. Part 2. A Love Blossoms in Secret. The romance between Margaret and Townsend developed in one of the great paradoxes of royal life within the public eye, yet simultaneously in secret. They were surrounded constantly by servants, courtiers, family members, and advisors. There was almost no private space, no sanctuary where they could be truly alone and away from scrutiny. And yet, somehow, they found ways to be together, to steal precious moments of genuine connection away from the watching eyes of others. They would arrange to be on the same royal tours and visits. They would find themselves alone in the quiet corridors of Buckingham Palace late at night, talking with the intensity of people who had found something precious and rare in an otherwise heavily constrained world. Those closest to them within the palace began to notice their connection. Lady Airlie, who served as a lady-in-waiting to the royal family for decades later, wrote in her published memoirs that she had observed the two of them together with growing concern, noting clearly in their interaction something that went distinctly beyond what could be explained as mere friendship. Queen Mary, Elizabeth, and Margaret's grandmother, was said to have disapproved of their closeness and made her displeasure known, though she never intervened directly. Yet what could realistically be done about it? Townsend was unfailingly loyal and honorable, and he was truly excellent at his job. No one could point to a single improper act or public scandal. There was simply the visible, undeniable chemistry between them, the way their eyes would meet across crowded rooms with unmistakable warmth. And connection, the way they seemed always to seek out each other's company whenever the opportunity arose. Their relationship deepened steadily throughout the late 1940s and into the early 1950s. For Margaret, Townsend represented everything her sheltered royal life had been desperately missing: genuine affection not based on her title. Real conversation conducted as equals between two intelligent people. Passionate connection that transcended the merely ceremonial and formal. She was, for perhaps the first time in her life, not playing the role of the princess, but simply being Margaret, a woman with her own hopes, desires, and dreams entirely of her own creation. For Townsend, Margaret was herself a revelation in a completely different way. Despite her royal status and the weight of expectation and duty that came with it, she was a living, breathing, vibrantly human being. She had opinions, sometimes quite forcefully and passionately expressed. She had dreams and real ambitions for her future. She had a playful, mischievous spirit that could break through the formality and stiffness that pervaded palace life and royal protocol. By 1950 and 1951, their relationship had become, without question, the worst-kept secret in British high society and the upper circles of the aristocracy. Courtiers in the palace, diplomats from foreign nations, members of the press who covered the royal family, and society figures who moved in royal circles all began to notice and comment on their obvious closeness. Photographers seemed always to be attempting to catch them together, or actively seeking opportunities to do so. Yet through it all, the palace maintained an official posture of absolute and complete silence on the matter. The relationship existed in a strange limbo of reality officially invisible and never publicly acknowledged, yet undeniably present and obvious to anyone paying careful attention. Then came a catastrophic event that would fundamentally transform the entire landscape. King George VI died on February 6, 1952, a date that changed everything. He was only 56 years old. Elizabeth, herself just 25 years old, suddenly and unexpectedly became queen. The entire constitutional structure shifted overnight. Townsend was retained in his role as equerry, but now he would be serving the new monarch, the young Queen Elizabeth. Margaret was deeply devastated by her father's death. He had been a loving, if somewhat emotionally distant, father figure throughout her life. In her profound grief over losing him, she found genuine solace and emotional comfort in Townsend's steady, reliable presence. He had known her father intimately and understood her loss from personal experience. He had been woven into the fabric of her life for as long as she could remember. Their emotional bond and connection only grew stronger during this period of shared mourning. If anything, their love seemed to intensify under the weight of sorrow and loss. Then came June 2nd, 1953, the coronation. The entire world watched the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Every member of the royal family was present. Margaret, dressed in exquisite gown, participated. During festivities afterward, Margaret and Townsend were photographed together. In the photograph, Margaret's hand reached up to adjust Townsend's uniform, a gesture of tenderness suggesting closeness beyond friendship. The picture was published. Within days, all of Britain discussed it. What was the relationship between the princess and the group captain? Why did she seem so comfortable? Why were they always together? The palace maintained silence. Behind closed doors, panic. Part 3. The Scandal and Division. Then came the coronation photograph, that moment captured in Westminster Abbey that would change everything. The picture was published in newspapers across the world. Within days, it seemed that virtually all of Britain, and much of the world, was discussing it, analyzing it, debating passionately what it meant and what it revealed. What exactly was the relationship between the princess and the group captain? Why did she seem so visibly comfortable and at ease in his presence? Why were they always so naturally together at official events? For the first time in perhaps the entire history of the modern British monarchy, the British public found itself genuinely and deeply divided on a matter directly concerning the royal family. On one side were those who were sympathetic to the young couple, particularly younger people and those living in the cities, who asked entirely logical and reasonable questions. Why shouldn't Princess Margaret be allowed to marry the man she loves? Why should love be sacrificed on the altar of tradition and church doctrine that seemed increasingly out of touch with the modern world? These were the voices of a generation that had lived through the horror and trauma of World War II, and who believed that things should be different, more modern, more humane. They saw no logical reason why Margaret should be denied personal happiness. But there was another powerful faction, the traditionalists, church officials, conservative politicians, the older members of society who saw the relationship as an absolute threat to the very stability and integrity of the monarchy itself. They argued passionately that the royal family was not merely a family, but an institution, almost a sacred institution that embodied the moral and religious virtue of the entire British nation. For the Queen's own sister, her closest family member, to marry a divorced man would be to tacitly condone divorce itself in the eyes of the nation. It would lower and diminish the standards of the monarchy. It would suggest that personal happiness and fulfillment mattered more than duty, sacrifice, and tradition. The Church of England's position was absolutely unambiguous and rigid. The Church would not, under any circumstances, marry a divorced person. The Church did not recognize divorce. Marriage was, in Church doctrine, indissoluble and eternal. A divorced person had broken a sacred vow made before God. The very idea was anathema to everything the Church stood for. And there was a crucial constitutional dimension that added layers of complexity. The monarch was the supreme governor of the Church of England. This wasn't merely ceremonial. It meant the Queen herself was responsible, in a very real sense, for upholding church doctrine and teaching. How could she permit her own sister to do something that the Church explicitly forbade? In 1953 and into 1954, the crisis escalated with remarkable speed and intensity. Margaret found herself pressured from all sides, from the government, from the Church, from her own family, from society at large. The Queen, her own beloved sister, was in an agonizing and seemingly impossible position. As the reigning monarch, she was bound by the laws of her realm and by her position as head of the Church of England. Yet as Margaret's sister, she wanted desperately for Margaret to be happy. But the pressure on Elizabeth from her government advisors, from church leadership, and from Parliament itself was immense, relentless, and seemingly unshakable. Prime Minister Anthony Eden and his government made it explicitly clear that if Margaret married Townsend, It would precipitate a genuine constitutional crisis. There was serious talk that Parliament might not even allow such a marriage to proceed under any circumstances. There were formal discussions about whether Margaret would be legally forced to renounce her titles, lose her position as a member of the royal family, lose her allowance, lose her apartments in Kensington Palace. She would become a private citizen, stripped of privilege and status. Townsend, facing this enormous institutional pressure arrayed against him, and recognizing that his presence was causing a constitutional crisis, made what he believed was a selfless and noble decision. In the summer of 1953, he requested a posting overseas. The palace agreed immediately, almost eagerly. In July 1953, he was sent to Brussels as air-attaché of the British Embassy in Belgium. This was a posting specifically designed to take him away from Margaret and to allow time and geographical distance to do what neither propriety nor pressure had been able to accomplish. The separation was profoundly agonizing for both of them. Margaret fell into a deep and serious depression. She had never known real heartbreak before, never been forced to make an impossible choice between her personal desires and her duty to the crown. Those who saw her during this period reported that she seemed visibly diminished. The sparkle and vitality that had always characterized her seemed to have been completely extinguished. She would retire early in the evenings, seeming listless and profoundly disinterested in the social activities that had once delighted her immensely. Letters were exchanged between them across the distance that separated them. These were passionate, devoted letters, expressions of undying love, convictions that somehow, someday, they would find a way together. Townsend, isolated in Brussels, wrote to Margaret of his love, of his deep conviction that their love was worth fighting for, that they would somehow overcome these obstacles. Margaret, lonely and bereft in London, wrote back of her own unwavering commitment, her refusal to accept that their happiness should be permanently sacrificed to propriety and tradition, that beneath the surface hope contained in their letters, nothing had fundamentally changed. Margaret still loved Townsend completely. Townsend still loved Margaret completely, and the institutional barriers to their union remained absolutely unshaken and unbroken. Then, in 1955, Townsend's posting in Brussels came to an end. After 2 years away, he was due to return to Britain. For Margaret and Townsend, the news was electrifying and filled them with hope. They would be reunited at last. But with the reunion came a crucial realization that both of them shared. Their feelings for each other had not diminished even slightly. If anything, the distance, the difficulty, the seeming impossibility of their union had intensified their love and made them even more certain of what they wanted and needed. Something remarkable happened in that moment, a moment of clarity and decisive action. Margaret, who was now 24 years old, no longer a girl, but a woman who had come through emotional suffering and had emerged with her convictions, and her will completely intact, made a profound decision. She would fight for her love. She would not quietly accept the dictates of church and state. She would not resign herself to a life of loneliness without joy or fulfillment. She had been forced to grow up, and in growing up, she had developed a will of her own. She and Townsend decided, together and in complete solidarity with each other, that they would pursue their love openly and unambiguously, regardless of the consequences. Part 4. The Crisis and the Impossible Choice. In autumn 1955, Margaret's intention to marry Peter Townsend became unmistakably clear. The Queen, despite her love for her sister, could not simply consent. The situation was far too complex, too politically significant, too constitutionally fraught. The situation required formal government position and legal framework. The Prime Minister made it official. Marriage would require Parliament's consent, governed by the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which stipulated that members of the royal family couldn't marry without the monarch's permission. But now it extended far beyond merely obtaining the Queen's permission. It had become constitutional, religious, and a matter of national significance. Constitutional experts were deeply divided. Some argued the Queen, as a private individual, had the right to consent to her sister's marriage. Others contended that as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, she couldn't give such consent. The Church's position was unambiguous. They would not marry a divorced person. The nation was gripped by the controversy. It was the first truly modern royal crisis. Letters poured into Buckingham Palace, Parliament, and the Prime Minister's office. The British people were split almost exactly down the middle, young and old. Progressive and conservative all weighed in with passionate opinions. Margaret was presented with a starkly impossible choice. She could marry Townsend, but would forfeit her royal titles, allowance, and line of succession. She would no longer be Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret, but simply Margaret Townsend, a private citizen. Or she could renounce Townsend and maintain her position as princess, keeping her income, title, and role. It was an impossible choice, designed deliberately to be impossible. The monarchy, the church, and government were all united against the couple. But the couple was equally united in their love. For a brief moment, love seemed it might triumph. There was talk of alternative arrangements, creative constitutional solutions, ways to make the marriage work while preserving Margaret's status. Townsend and Margaret met regularly. There was genuine hope in their hearts. But as weeks passed, as autumn turned to winter, as Christmas approached, reality crystallized. The walls of institutional opposition didn't crumble. The church didn't relent. Parliament didn't intervene. The monarchy didn't bend. Margaret and Townsend, facing the overwhelming weight of institutional forces arrayed against them, began to understand they didn't truly have a choice. Either they could be together and lose everything, or be apart and retain everything. No third option existed. Townsend realized that pursuing this marriage would damage the institutions he loved and served. He was not a selfish man. He was a man of duty proven through war and service. To insist on marrying Margaret facing such opposition would damage the monarchy, damage the country. Margaret realized that victory's cost would be too high. If she married Townsend and lost everything, became a private citizen cast from the royal family, what kind of marriage would it be? How long could love sustain itself built on such a foundation of loss and sacrifice? Both realized independently and together, perhaps love was not enough. Perhaps duty had to come first. Part 5. The End of a Dream. On October 31st, 1955, Halloween Margaret made an announcement that devastated millions around the world. After weeks of anguish, after sleepless nights, after consulting with the Queen and her advisors, Margaret came to a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not marry Peter Townsend. In a carefully worded, formally released statement, she declared that she had decided not to pursue the marriage. She wrote, "I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others." It was a noble statement, crafted with great care, with every word precisely chosen. But to those who read it carefully, to those who knew Margaret's heart, it masked an unbearable personal pain. Margaret had chosen duty over love. She had chosen her position, her role, her family, her responsibility to the crown, over the man she loved with all her heart. The immediate reaction was deeply complex and conflicted. Many in Britain, particularly those of a traditional bent, praised her decision as noble and appropriate. Here was the princess doing her duty, putting the stability of the monarchy ahead of her personal desires. She was showing the world that even the most privileged must sometimes sacrifice for something larger than themselves. It was noble. It was dignified. It was what royalty was supposed to do. But others, particularly younger people and those in the progressive community, were heartbroken and angry. They saw in Margaret's decision not nobility but tragedy. They saw a young woman being crushed by an outdated system, being forced to give up the chance at happiness because of conventions and rules that no longer made sense in the modern world. To them, Margaret became a symbol of the tragedy of duty without mercy, of tradition without compassion. For Peter Townsend, the news was absolutely devastating. He had known it was coming. They had discussed the possibility extensively in their recent meetings, but knowing and accepting are two very different things. He was heartbroken, deeply so. But he was too honorable, too much a man of duty himself, to contest her choice or argue against her decision. Townsend left Britain. He eventually made his way to Brussels and later to other diplomatic postings. He tried building a life without Margaret. Eventually, he remarried to a Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Germain. They had 2 children together. He found a measure of peace and contentment in his new life. But those who knew him said that he never entirely forgot Margaret, never entirely moved past the love that had so profoundly defined a crucial period of his life. Margaret remained a princess, her titles intact, her position secure, but she had paid an extraordinary price for maintaining her status. The jubilant, vivacious young woman of the early 1950s seemed to fade after that decision. She continued to perform her duties, to attend events, to smile for the cameras. But something had been extinguished within her. In 1960, Margaret would marry photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, a marriage that was technically approved and that did not require her renunciation of her title. But many observers noted that the marriage, for all its initial glamour and excitement, lacked the genuine passion of her love for Townsend. There was affection, perhaps, and certainly respect, but the kind of all-consuming, transformative love that she had felt for Peter Townsend, that was notably absent. The marriage would eventually end in divorce in 1978, which created a cruel irony. Margaret had sacrificed Townsend to avoid the stigma of divorce, and she ended up divorced anyway. Later in life, Margaret would struggle with various health issues, depression, and a sense that she had somehow missed out on the life she might have lived. She turned to alcohol and cigarettes, seeking comfort in ways that ultimately damaged her health. Those close to her said she never truly recovered from what she gave up. Peter Townsend lived a long and full life. He lived until 1995, reaching 80 years old. In his later years, he returned to Britain and was eventually reconciled with the royal family. He became something of a romantic figure in the public imagination, the dashing RAF officer, the war hero, the man whose love for a princess was deemed too scandalous for a kingdom bound by tradition and rigid protocol. The love story of Margaret and Townsend became a pivotal, defining moment in British royal history. It was perhaps the first time in the modern era that the personal desires of a royal family member were openly, publicly weighed against the demands of duty. Their story revealed something crucial about the monarchy, that even those born into greatest privilege were ultimately bound by rules and traditions from which there was no escape. Margaret could not simply decide to be happy. Happiness was not hers to claim. She was a princess first, a woman second, and duty, for better or worse, had to come before desire. What makes this story so enduringly fascinating is that it reminds us royalty, for all its glamour and mystique, is composed of real human beings with real hearts that can break just as easily as anyone else. Margaret chose duty over love. While many praised her sacrifice as noble, her life afterward suggested she never fully recovered from what she gave up. Their love story stands as a testament to passion's power and tradition's cost. It asks uncomfortable questions. Should tradition trump love? Should duty supersede happiness? Where is the line between personal freedom and public responsibility? Perhaps the real tragedy isn't that they were kept apart, but that their separation revealed the truth about royalty, that privilege and freedom aren't the same thing, that a crown is both glory and shame, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are asked to make the most ordinary sacrifice, the sacrifice of their own happiness. Thank you for watching. If this moved you, like this video and subscribe for more fascinating historical tales. Let me know in comments. Did you think Margaret made the right choice? Would you have done the same? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you in the next one.